Is an early career researcher, an oceanographer, and a postdoctoral researcher working at Northumbria University, and is currently the UK Polar Network Vice President. So Sam has got some insights from a different career stage to offer to us about the peer review process. So I'll let him share his presentation.
Yeah, hopefully you can all see that okay. Now, so yeah, I think I'm now 18 months out from my PhD, so certainly far from an expert on peer review, but I thought, yeah, I can share some kind of perspectives and how we kind of fit into the process and thoughts from this stage of our careers. So I think there's a few roles that we play as early career researchers in the peer review process. We have a role as authors, and in particular as ECRs, we're quite often corresponding authors and directly engaged in that peer review process. So we'll be the ones kind of responding to the reviews and all of that part of it. We might be asked to be reviewers in the formal peer review process. And there's also kind of other less formal forms of peer review that we might be involved in. So that's kind of various feedback that we might give. So often within departments, we might well support kind of grant proposals or kind of feedback on various bits of work. So kind of we all play into that in different roles as ECRs. So I kind of fit into this. My background's kind of experimental fluid dynamics in polar oceanography. And I've so far published 5 papers in a variety of different journals. I've contributed to peer review directly in 2 journals, but also in another 4 here, which are ones that I contributed kind of as a contributing peer reviewer, which is kind of my first point that I want to come on to, which is like, how do we get started doing peer review as ECRs? So my first main kind of point in this was co-reviewing with my PhD supervisor. So there was a few papers that she got us to review, which were particularly relevant to the work that I was doing during my PhD. And got in touch with the editors and asked if kind of it would be okay for me to contribute to those, which was really valuable experience for me, but also enabled me to kind of have input into that process. And often as ECRs, we're the ones who like have a lot of the most up-to-date literature. We're doing the literature reviews as parts of our PhD. We're doing the actual research. So hopefully have like those really useful insights that we can contribute. I think also once you start to publish, you get onto the radar of journals and their editors. So it's kind of a point where you'll start getting contacted more directly, as well as just kind of general networking to get started. A kind of second point of advice is to kind of be confident. A lot of ECRs will say that they don't think that they know enough about the topic to be a peer reviewer, and they don't really feel confident to do it. And I think my message is that like we really should. We are chosen by the editor to do this because they've seen what our expertise is. So they already know that we're ECRs. They know what career stage we are, and we absolutely do have the kind of expertise. And as I mentioned already, like ECRs are often very up to date and doing the work in a way that like we've got time to focus on doing the peer review, doing the research. So those perspectives can be quite unique and really helpful. I would just slightly caveat that, of course, though, we should always be, slightly wary and say no if a review really is far outside our expertise. And I think the other side is like when we're peer reviewing, we are kind of experts in the field, but ultimately this is the author's work, and there's that boundary between, you're making suggestions that are hopefully helpful and positive for science, but also not just directed in the way that you'd have done the work. It's not your work, it's theirs. So it should be helpful feedback. So I thought I'd just quickly go through kind of my process of how I do this, and I don't think this is perfect and it's very individual, but hopefully it's helpful to kind of get a bit of insight there. Firstly, whatever journal you've been asked to do it for, they often have different submission requirements. So I'd say most journals do want kind of a written report, but sometimes they will ask for like a really specific set of questions. And if that's what they want, then there's no point writing your report from the start. I tend to do 3 or 4 read-throughs of the paper, and I do print it out and mark it out kind of with pen and paper. I find that really helpful. It's the first time I'm kind of just trying to get a sense of the overall message, like how well is it overall presented? Is the story kind of a nice flow? And I make kind of general annotations, but nothing like too detailed at this point. I don't want to get too nitty-gritty. My second and potentially third kind of run through, I'm going to be looking through kind of the detailed checks, seeing like, does the logic flow? Is the evidence all there for each of the points that are made, and do the conclusions follow from that evidence? And do the kind of methods also add up? Like, are they good methods, or are they replicable? And kind of make all those notes as I go through them. And then finally, I'll go through one final look through and kind of make any comments on the general presentation, things that generally aren't going to sway my decision either way as to whether I think the paper should be accepted or not, but could make it improvement. And I quite often look at the availability of data. So is it being put into open access stuff? And also like the accessibility of figures. So is it colorblind friendly? Have you used like decent line width and things like that, which again just can be made as suggestions to improve the paper. And then kind of writing the report, I like to think about like how I like to receive feedback. We receive a lot of feedback, whether we've been doing our degrees and getting it on assignments, on our own journals on our own submissions from kind of co-authors and all that kind of stuff. I think there's also lots of examples that we can use to inform how we write our peer review reports. So looking at kind of open reviews, most of the EGU journals have open reviews that are really helpful. When you send your review, then you often then get the other reviewers' reports sent back to you. So that's a really useful reference point to see kind of like, have I got the tone right? Have they made points that I should have missed, or have they said stuff that I think was absolutely rubbish? These aren't necessarily correct, just they're useful reference points. And also think about like reports that you've received yourself and what did you like about them? And how can you make that feedback as helpful as possible? And I think largely about the author here, like I want to give feedback in a way that's constructive and can help them improve the paper. But there is also another audience, which is the editor, and you're helping them make a decision as to what to do with the paper. So try and bear that in mind as well. There's the other point to that, which is responding to reports. And there's kind of 2 parts that I'm covering simultaneously here. So that's when you're an author and you get your kind of peer review report, but also when you're a peer reviewer and there's the kind of back and forth. So you'll get your kind of response from a peer reviewer, but as a response from an author, and how do you respond to that? So I think the things I'm always thinking about is like the work is the author's, as I mentioned before. It's not your work to sway completely. You can give feedback and hopefully that will be taken on board. But you shouldn't completely change the story. I think also thinking that the peer reviewers have put a lot of time and energy in, and that's volunteer time. So be respectful when you're responding to them. And I try and always make clear like what are suggestions for the work that I think would improve it, and what are more fundamental issues. So I quite often quite focus on figures and stuff. Sometimes I think that figures are definitely in the wrong order, but that's generally just a suggestion. I would never suggest that a paper can't go through because the figure's not quite perfectly presented. If they're presenting absolute rubbish data that I really don't trust, then that's a major issue, and I need to kind of make those 2 distinctions quite clear. I think that's especially the case in subsequent rounds of review. Like I'm not going to try and hold up this paper because I want their panels to be in the right order. And just as a final point, I think particularly for ECRs, it's important that we're recognised for what we do. 2 kind of online systems that I use are the Web of Science Reviewer Recognition Service and ORCID, which both have means of kind of recognising peer review. I've got kind of a statement on my CV, which I don't think this one's perfect, but it kind of covers some things. And also just thinking about like how much peer review we're doing in relation to the amount we're publishing. If you think each peer review we do, we kind of have a couple of reviewers on, but also a few co-authors. So try and think about that balance, and whether you're doing enough or too much peer review. But I know editors are always desperate for more peer reviewers, so hopefully as ECRs we can contribute to that. Yeah, so thanks.
That was brilliant, Sam. Thank you so much for your contributions. Now we'll go to a late career stage. We'll have Pete back on. Hopefully you're sharing your work. If not, I'll share the presentation. Would you like to have a go? Brilliant. Just needs presenter mode. And if anyone's got any questions for Sam, please do write them in the chat and we'll cover them at the end.
Okay, well, sorry about the first attempt there. I don't know where it went, but my computer's good at doing that. As Nadia says, this is an introduction from an editor's perspective to various things about peer reviewing. Let's see if I can shrink that while I'm at it. Yes, I'm a late career scientist. I've been at this approaching 4 decades now. And I'm editor for a range of journals currently. Over my career, you could add a few more to that. It was nice that Sam raised the question of how much reviewing should you do? A lot of people say, well, basically aim at if you submit X papers a year and you realize that there are some rejections, then X plus a little bit is probably a good number to aim at. And the position I'm in, I've been a peer reviewer for over 120 journals over my entire career. There's a remarkable number of journals out there these days. And I currently typically review 2 to 4 papers a month and 4 to 6 research proposals. I mean, I'm including research proposals in this talk because that's the other form of reviewing that ECRs will hopefully fairly rapidly get involved in doing. All of that is aside from the work I do as an actual editor. What is peer review? Peer review is sort of fundamental linchpin or bit of groundwork for both the publishing process and grant funding. Most submitted articles and most applications are assessed by peers for journals and funding agencies. It's a fundamental part of the process. That leads to the question of what is a peer. In this context, I'd say it's somebody who has relevant knowledge of at least part of the material being assessed, and the function is to provide informed comment on that material. In reality, you look at many papers and many proposals, any one individual is probably not an expert on the whole thing, and that's something to realize and accept. It is also generally assumed that peer reviewers are independent in some respects of the submitting authors and institutions. This is not as black and white an area as you might think. Independence is sometimes sort of argued, well, you can't review something that one of your students, somebody was originally one of your students or your supervisors produced. Most journals and most review bodies put a sort of time limit on how long that independence functions for. And in fields like polar science, where communities are reasonably small, you can quite often get overlap, or it's very unusual in some respects not to know or to have worked with or to have interacted in some constructive way co-authors on multi-author papers. Peer review is a voluntary activity. As Sam noted, you can stick it on your CV. It can be beneficial in terms of how you're viewed in the academic community. It is some people would say it's an expected contribution to the academic community. In the context of proposal reviewing, in some countries at least, proposal reviewing is a paid or a rewarded activity, so it's not quite as voluntary in that respect. At present, that isn't the case with most academic paper reviewing, although there is more and more awareness of the publishing industry is there to make money out of publishing. We can't forget that, and it is increasingly pointed out in some fields that they can manage that because the peer reviewers and, for that matter, the editors are doing their work voluntarily, and yet the publishers are still making money out of it. Peer review experience can lead to progression into editorial and funding panel roles. They're both other significant things that can go on CVs. And for some people, they're things that are an interesting and a challenging aspect of the job. It is perhaps also worth remembering that peer reviewing is not a perfect process. Now, I'm going to go on and say in a second, well, typically papers have 2, 3, 4 peer reviewers, and those 2, 3, 4 peer reviewers produce overlapping, hopefully, but generally not identical reports. So each reviewer has a different set of opinions and a different set of issues that they pick up on. If you've only got a small number of reviewers, you're never going to pick up on every issue that might actually be relevant in a given paper. Why do we need peer review? It's a form of ranking. It's a form of assessing the accuracy, quality, and originality of the text in front of you. It's a reality that most journals, and certainly the higher ranking journals, and probably all funding agencies, are oversubscribed. They need a means of ranking or reducing down the number of documents, paper submissions, proposals in front of them. It's quite well known that some of the higher ranking journals and quite a lot of North American, European, UK funding agencies actually have probably less than 5%. People always say with nature and science, less than 2% success rates in submissions. That means they have to find a way of actually assessing and cutting out the vast majority of things that are submitted to them. They also don't want the reputational damage of being caught out for making clear errors. So they do rely on quality peer reviewers to identify what the problems are. Editors inevitably can't cover an entire subject area in the way that dedicated peer reviewers can. So peer reviewers are the main objective source of guidance that editors and panels rely on. And at present, there isn't another way of doing it. The system is fundamentally built on peer review. Reviewers can be at all career stages. In academic or scientific terms, we tend to think of it as being an activity that you might get involved in from late PhD stage onwards. But they can also be non-academic peer reviewers in some fields. I've given the example of conservation practitioners here because that's quite near to my own subject area. There is no specific academic requirement for a peer reviewer, but there has to be a level of knowledge or an appropriate level of knowledge for the paper being reviewed. One of the most typical ways of getting engaged in the peer review process, you'll discover very quickly as soon as you submit your first paper, because all of a sudden you'll be on journal or publisher databases, and quite often within days, certainly within a week or a month or two, you'll start getting requests pop up in your emails from journals you've never heard of saying, due to your expertise, we would love you to review this. So basically, you get known by the system. I'll come back to ones where the sort of thing that you should be looking for to accept peer review invitations in a minute. Key requirement for a peer reviewer is that you know something about the subject of the article or the proposal in hand. This is a piece of knowledge that will develop as your career develops, with your experience develops your career stage. So you should expect over time to become involved in, get invitation for reviewing papers for journals that are higher up the ranking order. And that shouldn't write off the possibility of reviewing for journals that are not so high up the ranking order. There can be perfectly good, relevant papers in them, usually more specifically linked to a given subject area. Peer review is something that people are not generally formally trained to do. I think part of the sort of fundamental reason for having this workshop. It's one of those things that you sort of learn by osmosis, and it could be done a lot better. A particularly good way of getting involved in peer review, and some supervisors or managers are very proactive in doing this, is to use their expertise, or for them to proactively involve you by directing opportunities to peer review to you. Quite a few journals, and certainly I think most of the journals I'm currently involved with, when we write to reviewers, we will quite often include a sentence that says, if you are unable to do this yourself, but you have appropriate students or postdocs who could do this with your guidance, we are more than happy for you to pass review requests on to them. And we simply ask that they then come back to us and say who they passed it on to. And the supervisor plays an important role then in mentoring the initial drafts that the new reviewer starts to produce. Also worth watching out with journals that you're familiar with for opportunities where they ask volunteers to join their list of reviewers. Not all journals do this, but some do. Some have a sort of review panel in the background, and they quite regularly have calls out there asking for people to join those panels. Journals generally look for a small number of reviewers. I've put 2 to 3 here, but depending on the form of paper, they may accept a single robust review. Some journals, I've certainly seen journals where an article has come back with 6 reviewers, which seems quite amazing. I can't find 6 reviewers for a single paper in the journals I edit for. Most journals, when you're submitting a paper, will ask you for reviewer suggestions. You're probably aware of that already. As an editor, I look to get a mix of reviewers that are suggested by the authors and reviewers that we find ourselves. And you might think that the author-suggested ones are more likely to give you an easy ride as an author. In my experience as an editor, the author-suggested ones are often more critical than the ones I find myself. So on balance, I think the mixture is a good idea. You may also get asked to re-review a manuscript that you've previously reviewed and has been revised, as Sam mentioned. When you first receive an invitation, probably 2 very simple but important questions to ask yourself is, am I really appropriate for this? The answer with all those ones I receive is most of the time I'm not. You get a ridiculous number of review requests from journals that appear not to know what subject you're in. The second important one is, do I have time to do it? If you don't, either of those questions, say no. As an editor, please say that quickly, because until we have responses from the reviewers we've asked, we can't then move on to ask the next reviewer or next potential reviewer. And if you're an author, one of your biggest frustrations will be with the submission process will be how long it takes to find reviewers. So there is a good reason for answering quickly. It was appropriate to look at the quality of the requesting journal and the requested turnaround time. MDPI journals, and there are some perfectly good MDPI journals, despite all the sort of political rhetoric around different publishers, have this odd request that they insist reviewers produce a report within a week. That's not possible for many, many reviewers. And you have to balance these voluntary roles that you can do with the primary work requirements that you have, whether you're a research student or postdoc or whatever else. You need to think whether you have any potential conflicts of interest. I'm not going to try and list those here. People might want to ask questions about those. Some journals specify what they consider these to be. Others ask you to ask them if you have any doubts. Very often, these conflicts of interest fall in that grey area I mentioned. What you bring it up with the editor and say, well, I worked with X 5 years ago, or Y was my student 5 years ago. Some journals will say, no, we can't accept that. Others will say that's long enough ago for us to trust in your independence. Next thing to do, once you're looking to accept the paper, accept the review request, is scan the paper and see how much of it you can usefully comment on. At least in part because some journals ask you to fill in some questions about that as a preamble to your review report. And it's useful for the editor, again, to know how much you think you're able to address. Once you've accepted a review request, try to keep within the requested time frame. That, again, is for the benefit and to be decent to the authors. People will often say, how long should reviews take? And okay, this is something that as your experience develops, the time will get shorter. I would say most papers that I review today take me between 3 and 6 hours, so less than a working day. That's not absolutely all. Some take longer than that. Some take only an hour. Most students I talk to during their first review will end up saying, I've spent all week working on this review. There is no real intention for reviews to take that much of your time. You only have so much time available. And it's important thinking about that your review is not meant to be a full reanalysis of the paper or data. You're not pretending to be an author looking at the same data set and seeing if you can do exactly the same thing. I'm not going to read through all of these questions that you should ask yourself, but these questions get at the heart of what you're looking for when you read through a paper, when you start thinking about whether the paper's constructed appropriately, whether it contains all the information it should, whether it's clear, whether there are alternative explanations or alternative hypotheses. whatever the terminology is appropriate to the paper. But there's a whole set of, in a way, relatively straightforward questions to think, how does this paper fit? How does this paper deliver these? Sam mentioned that there is a report you have to write. Obviously, this is the review. The purpose of that report is to integrate any issues that do relate to those questions on the last slide. The form of the report very much depends on the journal. Some journals have very specific forms that you fill in the slots in. Others give you almost free range to write a completely free text report. Most journals will ask you for a recommendation on the continuum accept to reject. Generally, they ask you that as a simple set of tick boxes in the online form that most use. Quite a few journals will ask you not to include an explicit recommendation in the text that you write that goes back to the authors. Not all. Some journals are perfectly happy for you to write that sort of recommendation. Most journals also ask for an open report that goes to the authors, and they have a box for confidential comments to the editor, which does not go to the authors. That box is really only for raising either any very specific concerns you identify. I most commonly use it for a very brief summary of my overall assessment. And if there's nothing to say, leave it blank. You don't have to fill it in. When you are writing your comments, it's quite often simplest or easiest to organize it by having two main sections. One I've called for major comments. This is the sort of example Sam was putting in where if something is actually fundamentally wrong, then this is the section where you need to say it. The other section, which is usually bigger, is for, I'm calling minor revisions. You can look at that as suggestions. These are things that you might have an opinion would improve the revised manuscript, but are not necessarily things that are fundamentally required for a manuscript to be published. Overall, try and keep your report concise. I would typically say 1 to 2 pages in terms of old-fashioned typescript. And it doesn't have to be as long as that. Remember, you can actually say that a paper is good as it is, few or no revisions are required. There's an increasing tendency over time for people to think reviews must always go into some detail and find something wrong. It's perfectly possible that a submission is fine as it is. Try to be constructive, try to be polite in your suggestions. It is a reality that there will be occasional papers where there is no alternative but to say that something is not correct or that it is already known. Again, just say it politely and directly. Don't go into any form of emotive language. You'd be surprised what people do sometimes write in reviews. Also, avoid suggestions that simply rewrite the paper in your own preferred writing style. And where you're dealing with papers that are authored by non-native English-speaking authors, do your best to support. I would say, I mean, the journal I'm the main editor for, Antarctic Science, we openly deal with a very international source range for authors, some of which very definitely do not have strong English. And I do think it's important to assess the science first as far as you can and view the language as a secondary issue. That doesn't get away from the fact that ultimately we somehow have to turn papers into good, presentable English. This is my last slide. I'm going to turn it upside down. Everything so far has been how do you do peer review? Now, you get into this because you write papers. And I say this is one of the catalysts for you suddenly receiving requests to reviews. But how should you deal with reviews when you receive them? It's always a bit daunting, particularly when you haven't had many submissions or for your first submission. You put in this paper that you think you worked your heart out for, you think you've made a good story out of, and 2 months later you get reviews back and everything feels very depressing. One important tip, even before you submit your paper, is to try and read over the late draft of your paper independently. Very hard thing to do when you first start doing it, but try and read it over thinking as a reviewer. If you were a reviewer of that paper, what would you pick up as weaknesses? The reviewer isn't you. They haven't been engaged with your project for the last 3 years. They haven't got an answer to everything that you might think you have an answer to. Try to address what those weaknesses are before you submit the paper. When you do get a verdict from a journal that asks for a revision of some sort, and that is the vast majority of papers, treat this constructively. It's not an invitation to immediately attack or argue with all the reviewer comments. I call it a path of least resistance, but in the vast majority of cases, most reviewer comments are very straightforward to absorb. And while you might not like every single form of word or suggestion that they put in, it makes very little difference to the final paper to absorb the non-controversial comment. What that does leave you the chance to do is choose very carefully any comments that you really do disagree with, or you really do want to draw a line and stay with your original point. When you do this, make it clear in your revised manuscript text the logic of why you are sticking with a given point. And also, most journals will ask for a point-by-point rebuttal document, and in other words, answers to reviewers. In proposals, some funders also give the opportunity to respond. Now, for journals in particular, carefully constructed and carefully argued rebuttal documents can save the day. And that's even if the original reports are on the face of it, very long and very complex. If you've got a very good answer, editors do listen to that. Throughout all of this, be polite, be constructive, be respectful, as Sam said. And as a final small point, if you are going to take longer than the journal initially asked for in the revising process, be proactive and contact the editor in advance to ask for an extension. Most often, in reality, these are given. And that is not the case for proposals. With proposals, whatever deadlines you have to stick to them absolutely. And hopefully, that's me for now.
Thank you so much, Pete, for sharing your thoughts and for an awesome plenary talk. I think we will continue with the panel sort of small talks before we can open the floor for discussion. So next in line, we have our next panelist, Dr. Lauren Andrews. Lauren is a glaciologist at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. She is also an associate editor at the Journal of Geophysical Research. Over to you, Lauren.
Thanks, guys. And I've reorganized my slides so to keep this short so that Bob has enough time and then we have enough time for discussion. So I'm going to talk today just about some of my general opinions about reviewing. So I've been reviewing for 11 years, so not quite as long as Pete. I review for NASA, NSF, many European science organizations, and I've reviewed for essentially nearly every single journal that you can review for in glaciology. And I also am a reviewer for our internal memos that we produce here in the Global Modeling and Assimilation Office. I want to emphasize that anything that I say today are my own personal views, and if they are contentious, they are very much contentious because it's me. And so I think the first thing, here we go. The first thing I want to emphasize is be professional. That is like the basic principle of being an author, being a peer reviewer, being an editor, being professional. And being professional means taking the time, right? You can write something very quickly that gets the gist, but it doesn't convey the appropriate tone, and it doesn't provide the necessary clarity to be useful for authors, or if you're an author, actually respond to the comments. So really take that time. So first off, I put this in because I think that it's really useful for early career people, because I never knew. I just waited until I got my first review request. But AGU actually provides a series of webinars on submitting and reviewing and how to appropriately respond to reviews. And I've also put in links to how to sign up to be a reviewer for AGU and for the Cryosphere. Generally, once you've sort of published, most of these journals do a pretty good job of sort of scraping Google Scholar to add you to their potential list of reviewers. But in case you wanted to add yourself, it's always helpful to have a link, and there's a form to fill out in most cases. So pretty straightforward. This is sort of the review process, which many of you I'm sure are very familiar with, but essentially a manuscript is going to go through a series of checks and then an evaluation by the editors. It will be either rejected or you'll be asked to provide additional information. Then we'll have evaluation from reviewers, and the process continues until we either reject it or we accept it. So it can take a little while. But I wanted to talk about both being an author and then being a reviewer. And so as an author, I think you have a responsibility to make the review process as smooth as possible. And like Pete mentioned, I think as a first author, one of the things that you should ask yourself before you submit a paper is, could I review this manuscript easily, right? Are the figures clear? Is it well done? Is the writing reasonable? Do the sentences flow? Things like that, like editorial things that reviewers aren't really supposed to provide insight on, but often end up doing because it's not very clear in that particular manuscript. Only you as the author can prevent bounce back. Make sure your manuscript fits the topic of the journal. Ensure the basic journal guidelines are met. Check that the data requirements are fulfilled. I don't know how many papers I send back because I click the link and the data is not there. And AGU does require that now. Make sure your manuscript has line numbers and is easily readable. I guess maybe once I turned 40, I'm like, double space, please. Use templates. Most journals have templates available. I think do your editor a solid. Provide multiple reasonable suggestions for reviewers. Like Pete mentioned, I tend to do a mix of ones that you have suggested and ones that I find myself. If you want to speed up the process, providing a list of reasonable reviewers can really help that. Because then I'm like, oh, great, this is a great option. I'll just send it to them. They'll accept. It goes quicker instead of me trying to find, like, do the actual research, find an appropriate reviewer, ask for that reviewer, wait a week until they decline, find another one. So, avoid conflicts of interest when you're suggesting people. I see this really frequently, that you will suggest someone at the same university as one of your co-authors. That's generally a no-go. I'll send it out, but many people personally feel that's a conflict of interest. And then common names, not to name anyone in particular, but like Twyla's very busy. And so if you list Twyla Moon on the potential reviewers, I might send that out to Twyla, but probably not, because I know she's very busy. And then communicate to into the editor if you have any deadlines, right? Like, are you graduating? That's helpful for me to know. I can help speed things along if that's the case. Then over to the other side of this slide, response to reviewer matters. Be clear, concise, and polite. Ensure the responses reference the appropriate new line numbers. That helps a ton when I go through a manuscript and I'm like, did they address the reviewer's comments? I think it is completely reasonable to push back. If you disagree with a statement made by a reviewer, you can do that, but do it judiciously. Don't pick, 30% of the points and be like, no, sorry, that you're wrong, or we're not going to address that. One or two that you truly fundamentally disagree with, that's fine. And that's up to the editor to make a judicious decision about whether to accept your argument or require that you actually make the modification. Or often what I do is say, that's fine. I need a statement or two in the manuscript that sort of illustrates this potential conflict. If you explain something in your response, it should probably be in the manuscript. So occasionally I will get responses to reviewers where there is some description on a point that a reviewer has brought up with a new figure and a full half page of text, and then there's no reference to that in the manuscript. That isn't sort of best practice, because if there was an unclear point that the reviewer brought up, you should be addressing that in your paper. Rejections happen. They have no bearing on you as a scientist or a person. They just happen. And along with that, occasionally the editor's decision may differ from those of the reviewers. And that's because they have a more holistic view of multiple reviews of your manuscript. They've read it probably more than the reviewers have. And they have a sense of what a journal might be accepting, what they will be accepting, so on and so forth. And then along with being an author, being a good co-author during this process can be really helpful. You know, review that manuscript before submission, act as that more objective reviewer. Help with reviewer suggestions, especially if you're working with someone that is younger than you, who might not know the field as well. Or if you're working with someone who's older than you and you actually might have a better sense of what the current literature is, like be like, actually, like this mid-career person might be a really good reviewer here. And then I think the thing that I really I think is really valuable when I have my co-authors do this is check the response to reviewers for tone. That can be really helpful because you are that one step away from that manuscript and you're not the first author. So you can be like, hey, actually, maybe this wasn't, you know, you could like tone it down and be a little bit more polite in this, you know, response. That can be really helpful. Okay, so then I'm just going, you can look at my other slides that sort of go into like how to review, what questions you should ask yourself. But here are some of my personal tips for reviewing. I think before you say yes to a review, you need to decide why you review and what you review. And this is at the largest scale, right? Do you review for for-profit journals? Some of my colleagues don't, some of them do. Do you review for journals on a predatory journal list? Those are decisions that you need to make personally, and they are important and can help sort of limit the number of review requests that you get or that you have to decide whether to accept or not. And then the other thing, I think, because we have small communities, is be cautious about reviewing multiple manuscripts from the same set of authors. Right? We want a diversity of opinion. I shouldn't be reviewing 3 papers in a row from the same person. That's generally like you're creating an echo chamber there. My general rule of thumb is keep no more than 2 reviews on your desk. It takes time. You know, even now I still take about 8 hours to do a thorough review. So be cognizant of that and decline, as Pete said, promptly, because that allows us to move through the review process faster. And if you can provide alternative reviewers, please, I'll take them. It's hard to find reviewers these days. And then, oh, there, okay. So once you accept a review, I think consider the author's position and career stage. I would provide a different review for a senior researcher than I would provide for a graduate student's first paper, right? And that's really important because you want to maintain professionality, but also you learn as you go through the review process. You become more inured to dealing with differences of opinion. Check your biases, right? I'll admit right here and now that I am harder on female authors than I am on male authors, and I shouldn't be. And so I always try to check myself when I do that. Write your review from a place of support, right? We are a community and we are all contributing to that community. So if you are attacking someone in a review, like that's not okay. You're not supposed to attack people. You're not even supposed to attack ideas. You're supposed to critique them in a holistic way. How I do reviews, I read the manuscript once, I jot down my general feel, sort of where I think the major points of issue might be, and then I step back and I walk away for a day, right? Because I don't want my sort of like initial opinion to color my review. Then I come back, I read the review or the manuscript again and provide specific line comments and adjust any of my large comments that might have been colored by my initial impression. Don't write anything that you wouldn't be comfortable putting your name on. Do not write anything that you wouldn't be comfortable saying in person. Don't make the author guess. Provide a line number. Be very clear about what you mean. Provide that reference, because that can be really frustrating as a reviewer where you're like, okay, I kind of see your point, but I'm not exactly sure what direction you want me to go here. And then something that I really prefer, only because I've had personal attacks and reviews sent to me, is use that third person, or even better, use the manuscript does this, or the manuscript fails to do this, not you fail to do this. And then finally, because only this has started to come up a little bit more frequently, the confidential comments to the editor should have the same tone as the review seen by the authors. It can be very challenging as an editor when you get a pretty reasonable review, and then you have comments that are only to you, not to the authors, that are very sort of derogatory or you know, or not in line with what you've written. And so making sure, you know, use the confidential comments if you want. I don't think they're necessary a lot of times, but they should have the same tone as that review that you are willing to share with authors. And with that, I will stop. And I think I still went too long for Bob, but there are a whole bunch of references or links in my presentation that you can use.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for an excellent talk. So Nadia just shared the link to a document where you can put in your name, and slides will be shared after the workshop. So lastly, it's my honor to introduce our last panelist, Professor Bob Hawley. Bob is a professor at Dartmouth College who has also been serving as a program officer in Arctic System Sciences at US National Science Foundation. He has also served as the president of AGU Cryosphere Sciences. Over to you, Bob.
Thanks so much, Afzal, and I'm happy to run the anchor leg here. I've set myself a timer for 5 minutes so that we might be able to have just a couple minutes for questions. I'll try to avoid repeating things that others have said. But what I did mostly was just I took Afzal's questions that he sent out to me, and I kind of was like, okay, here are the various things. And so before I start, though, I want to reiterate what Lauren said. As a government employee, I am at NSF, but I'm wearing my Dartmouth hat. You can see Dartmouth Hall behind me, and any views I express are not necessarily those of NSF. So the biggest misconception that most people have about the peer review process is that it is not what you did with your classmates in undergrad. I actually teach a class where I show students what the peer review process looks like, and they had no idea. And this is the case for the general public as well. They just thought, oh, you give it to a couple of people, they look at it and they say, hey, this looks pretty good. And so what surprised me, I thank you for this question, went thinking back way back to my very first experiences with the peer review process. I was very surprised both at who it was that was actually reading my paper, like some of the big names in my field. I was like, wow, this is incredible. But also how thoughtful and thorough these reviews were. So this is super useful. The three things that I think make for a good paper that make it easy to review, and if your paper is easy to review, it will also be a good paper: organization, clarity, and concision. These are the three, I would say, the three most important pieces. I put a little bullet there on this thing I call the dissertation syndrome. As a reviewer, I feel like I can usually tell if the paper I'm reviewing started out in somebody's dissertation, because it almost invariably has way too many words in it. It's a very different process writing a dissertation chapter versus writing a paper. And so if you're trying to figure out how to turn your dissertation into a paper, make sure you're aware of that. As a specific questions for me, Afzal asked, like, okay, how has peer review evolved in terms of funding proposals and things? And what I want to throw out there is, as a former department chair, as a senior faculty member, I've looked at a lot of tenure and promotion cases. I've written a lot of letters for tenure and promotion. And publications versus grants on your CV. In a lot of cases, in a lot of these conversations, I've heard folks say, well, look, you can get a paper published eventually. It may get rejected the first time from the first journal. It may get rejected for the second journal. Eventually, it'll get published. But to get a grant, this time you're writing for money, and it's a lot more difficult. And so a lot of times I find that these committees will put a significantly greater weight on grant proposals that get funded versus publications. Over the last 20 years, couple of decades, the landscape of publications has changed. I think Lauren mentioned and Pete mentioned just how many journals there are out there now. And so that's been a huge change. Also, the landscape of funding has changed, especially in the last 6 months, but I won't go further than that here. In terms of things that are outside your expertise, this is something that a couple of others have already talked about. I would say just be upfront with your editor, especially, but also remember, especially as an early career scientist, you graduate from your PhD thinking you know everything about this tiny little thing and nothing about anything else. But you're wrong. You know a lot about a lot of things, and it is the author's job fundamentally to communicate their science to you. So don't let your sort of early career stage be a barrier to your feeling like, okay, I should be able to review this paper. This whole question of remaining anonymous, I liked how Lauren said, don't write anything that you wouldn't feel comfortable putting your name to. And I totally agree with that. I find that as often as not, I remain anonymous, partly because of the optics. As I think Pete said, there are very few people in this community that I don't know. And I don't want various people to think I was easy on them because I know them, or I was hard on them because I know them. I just avoid it entirely. I think that having credit, as Sam pointed out, there's ways of getting credit for your peer reviews outside of that anonymous piece. I won't talk about the story of having seen a prior publication. I'll go back to these last couple of pieces. Pete suggested the 2 parts of what I consider my 3-part review synopsis. I always think of this item 3 of minor points always really needs to have line numbers associated with it. And so whenever I'm doing my first read through, I always hang up on these minor points. I just put them down and then I can get past them. As Lauren suggested, the professional voice is very, very important. When you get rejections, when you get harsh criticism, breathe. And also remember, it is your job to communicate the science to the reviewers, right? So it might be that your science was great, but you didn't successfully communicate it. So remember that piece. And then the last, I feel like there might be some, yeah, there was one last thing that nobody's mentioned yet. If I could change anything, I would make the peer reviews dual anonymous. And this may contradict some of the stuff that Lauren was mentioning, which I think was really important about consider who you're reviewing for, who's the author. But at the same time, it's very, very easy to see a paper from some giant in the field and go, oh, well, if I don't understand it, it must just be right, and it's me that doesn't understand it. That's not how it should be. And so it really, really ought to be, is it understandable? Not just whether or not you can get it. So I'm going to leave it there because I want to leave 1 minute for questions. Sorry to have to race through that so fast.
Thank you so much, Bob, for the awesome talk. So I think now is a good time to ask any questions. So from the audience, if you have a question, please either put it in the chat or just raise your hand and speak up.
I also don't have a hard stop at noon, so if people want to hang out a little bit longer, I'm willing.
Well, we had actually prepared a document full of questions. So I don't know, Pete, Sam, Lauren, what's your availability? Do you want to stay on for another 5 minutes? I think Afzal and Meghan need to.
I'm happy. I'm easy.
hang on.
Yeah.
We could do a couple of questions if everyone's a little bit shy. But if you do have a question, put your hand up and just write in the chat. So thank you all so much for your talks. Super interesting, really nice perspectives. I think We could start. Afzal and Meghan, are you leaving or are you staying on the
You're
chat?
here, so should be good.
Okay. Great. So what are the strategies for writing a constructive and professional peer review, especially for first-time reviewers? Like your very, very first paper, what do you think the key thing? I know you've all outlined lots of different points, but just particularly one. Let me think of a better question.
I think one thing I would say with that is be prepared to go to your supervisor or a more senior peer. I always like people to put their first draft together themselves because they're expressing themselves. But having done that, bounce that off somebody that you do know and you respect. And generally speaking, I would say a supervisor or a direct manager is familiar with your work or that area. So get advice. Don't be frightened. Don't be sort of so scared that you don't confide in somebody else.
That's really good.
Yeah. I've just said exactly the same thing. Get some advice and work with somebody on it. I think is yeah.
Yeah,
So-
I think.
Go ahead.
No, you please.
I think that's a good advice that I didn't take. I actually got a review that someone had given that they were willing to share in confidentiality, of course, and use that as sort of a template. And so apologies to the person whose paper I first reviewed.
I think the other thing that Sam maybe pointed out is that you can now see a lot of reviews in open journals. This is not the case when I first started. There were just no open journals. And so reading other people's reviews is really useful.
Awesome.
Yes, so thank you so much. There's a question by Tina. Hi, thank you for all the informative talk. One of my friend needs to get one publication for her PhD graduation, but one of her co-author is taking time to get back to her. How should my friend deal with the co-author so she can submit the paper in time? Bit off topic, but a good and relevant question. So anyone would like to take it?
Like oddly enough, I've had two very similar requests in different journals that I edit for recently, where I mean at least the person concerned is informing me of a deadline, which I think was one of the points. Did Lauren raise that one?
Yeah.
So at least I was aware there's a deadline, but you still have to get a review in. In a circumstance like that, if the person the person concerned is a student, so she has a supervisor. I would try to involve a supervisor in this. So there's an extent to which you should talk to co-authors, so you should make them aware of deadlines. If it's proving intractable for whatever reason, then go up the system a bit and just trying to get some direct support from a supervisor in the system there.
Yeah, I can chip in with what not to do, which is do not submit this paper without that co-author's consent.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because that's happened before in my experience, not by me.
Mm.
Many journals do have a check now where all of the co-authors have to agree before something goes out to publication, but definitely like communicate directly with that co-author. Even in this day and age, the phone can make a huge difference. It's really hard, but it's very helpful. And also, yeah, your supervisor.
And lastly, although I feel like this is like an externally imposed deadline for the PhD, remembering that journal publications take a long time. They just always do. And they're always going to take longer than you think.
I think there is one thing I would add there, and it almost sounds like a dodge. The reality is all papers will be revised. So you can have a conversation. I'm not sure I really want to be seen to recommend it too much. Because look, we really do need to submit this, but there will be opportunity to revise the information in that at a later date. So yes, there's a hard deadline as far as the university and the PhD goes, and I'm well aware those exist, but the hard deadline is submission, not publication.
Thank you so much for the responses. Are there any last questions? We are 5 minutes past our due time. Nadia, do you have any?
I've just got one more, I think more from a early, if you need to leave, do go ahead, but from an early career researcher perspective, how do you really get in there with the process if you don't necessarily have links with supervisors that are strong or necessarily, I don't know, willing to collaborate and support you? Are there other ways that you can get experience with peer review?
I would say I would let the editors comment on this, but I would say tell the editors you want a peer review because they're always looking. As a program officer, I'm always looking. So if you want a review for my program, definitely let me know.
I think
Yeah, so honestly, I put the links in. Generally, when I am looking for reviewers, AGU requires 3. And I'm looking for a mix of career levels, right? Because honestly, some of the best reviews come from early career scientists. So if you have that first paper published, like sign up. And, you know, also just seriously email me if you're really interested in reviewing.
I think as well, as soon as you do have that first paper, things do start coming in. It's kind of something I worried about initially, but you don't get any requests for a while, but they really start coming in as you start to publish. So
if you accelerate that to later in the career, I probably get between 4 and 8 review requests generated that way a day, because once you're on these spreadsheets or these databases that people use, they don't let you escape. Now, many of those are completely irrelevant, and they get a quick no out of it. But you'll very quickly move from the position of saying, why doesn't anybody ask me, to why the hell can't I escape this?
Thank you all for your responses. Thanks, Bob, for checking the chat. So there is a question by Alejandra, which Bob responded to. How much time before hard deadline should a PhD student be submitting their paper? Should 3 months be enough? And we can end with this sort of question. If there's any thoughts anyone would like to add. Thanks, Lauren, for adding your comment. Okay, so I'll just read the comments. It's 6 to 8 months coming from Lauren and Bob. And I think at this point, we can sort of close this discussion. So first of all, I'd like to thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you to our distinguished panelists who shared their experience with peer reviewing. If you like this session, stay tuned for more, where we hope to cover sessions about writing and reviewing grant proposals and policy reports. Don't forget to follow UK Polar Network and the US Association of Polar Early Career Scientists. The information is given in the chat. With that, I'd like to thank you again for joining and have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much, and bye-bye.
Thanks very much, everyone. Bye.
thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much to all the panelists.